One of the biggest questions involving the Second World War relates to the largest concentration camp and how much the Allies knew about what was happening. The question as to Auschwitz and why it was not bombed by the Allies is a question that has been asked for decades following the end of the war. And there is a belief amongst many that the Allies could have prevented some of the deadly operations inside of the camp, thus saving some lives and people from the gas chambers. Auschwitz would be a site where over 1 million people were exterminated, and many would be sent to their deaths within minutes of arriving at the site on the railway. But there were many people who would not even make it off the trains, such was the horrific conditions that they were kept in. But the question as to bombing Auschwitz and the train lines is very complex, and there are a number of moral issues around this, especially as the Allies would have been seen as bringing civilians into further harm with raids. Join us today as we look at the reasons why the Allies did not bomb the Auschwitz railway lines. As always, to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. The first thing to consider when looking at why Auschwitz's train lines were not bombed and attacked is that the Allies knew what was happening inside of the concentration camps. They did know that thousands of Jews were being sent to concentration camps every single day. They had managed to gain intelligence on this. In 1942, Lieutenant Jan Karski, a Polish soldier and resistance fighter, reported on the state of Poland, and also the destruction of the Warsaw Ghetto, and also how the extermination camps, which had been set up by the SS, were being used to murder and slaughter. Karski told the British, Polish and American government on the situation, including the liquidation of the Warsaw Ghetto, but he did not specifically mention about how the SS were murdering by gas, and he would tell the other governments that he believed that Jews were being sent to concentration camps. They were then being executed using other means, such as electrocution. Karski met with many political leaders and spoke with the British Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden, and he recalled what he had seen. And he travelled to London in 1943, then went to America and spoke with President Roosevelt about what was happening. FDR did not really take his report seriously, and his report was considered a key piece of information for the Allies. But he also met with many other important people, including those in Hollywood and the media, to talk about what was happening, and many of those who Karski spoke to did not believe what was actually happening, and they refused to believe how awful the SS and the Nazis truly were. While this was happening during the Second World War, the armies of the enemies of the Germans would uncover atrocities and massacres carried out by the Germans, but the Allies would in December 1942 condemn these atrocities. Anthony Eden, the British Foreign Minister, stated, Jews are being transported in conditions of appalling horror and brutality to Eastern Europe. In Poland, which has been made the principal Nazi slaughterhouse, the ghettos established by the German invaders are being systematically emptied of all Jews, except a few highly skilled workers required for war industries. None of those taken away are ever heard of again. The able-bodied are slowly worked to death in labour camps. The infirm are left to die from exposure and starvation, or are deliberately massacred in mass executions. The number of victims of these bloody cruelties is reckoned in the many hundreds of thousands of entirely innocent men, women and children. So far as the responsibility is concerned, I would certainly say it is the intention that all persons who can properly be held responsible for these crimes, whether they are the ringleaders or the actual perpetrators of the outrages, should be treated alike and brought to book. With this admission, it's clear that the British knew about the mass executions and the horrific conditions, but this was in 1942, and why did the Allies not do anything about this? Auschwitz would become more deadly as the years rolled on, and if they had destroyed part of the railway or disrupted the transport operations to the camp, then surely the Allies could have saved many lives, as the infrastructure of the camp would be broken, and the Germans would have to utilise other smaller sites. These could not cope with the huge numbers of deportations like Auschwitz could, but further people in power would speak out about what was happening. But the representatives between the Americans and the British did hold discussions about what to do with the Jews who would be liberated. The only conclusion reached during this meeting was that the war against the Nazis must be won at all costs, but the question as to bombing the railway lines of Auschwitz was not even raised. But the British and Americans received further reports about what was happening inside of Auschwitz. The British decoded radio messages sent from the German order police about prisoner death tolls from the concentration camps, and this did include Auschwitz. But they then managed to receive reports from prisoners or those within the Polish underground. There were some who managed to escape, and the Polish underground began to produce leaflets and newspapers about the conditions of Auschwitz and what was truly happening. They even managed to pass on the site plans of Auschwitz to the British, and one former prisoner would state, "The Polish resistance movement kept informing and alerting the free world to the situation. In the last quarter of 1942, thanks to the Polish emissary Jan Karski and his mission, and also by other means, the governments of the United Kingdom and of the United States were well informed about what was going on in Auschwitz-Birkenau." The closest the Allies would get to bombing Auschwitz from the sky was probably flying reconnaissance aircraft over the site, and this was first photographed on the 4th of April 1944, 2 years after they found out what was happening. But then some action did take place, and on the 26th of June 1944, 71 B-17 heavy bombers who were on a bombing run somewhere else flew close to the free railway lines that were heading to Auschwitz, but they would not let their payload go and destroy the railway lines. The Allies would, during the Second World War, want to disrupt the infrastructure of the German army, and there were many different raids to blow up the railway lines used by the Germans, conducted by resistance and sabotage groups, but also by bombing raids from the Allies. But the American War Department had been asked by Jewish leaders to bomb the railway lines leading to Auschwitz, and in 1944, in July, the department refused these requests. 452 bombers from the 15th Air Force after this flew along and across the 5 railway lines used for deportations, as they would bomb Blechhammer's oil refineries which were close by. The Allies did strike Auschwitz, as the Buna Werke, the IG Farben industrial complex found outside of the Auschwitz Free Monowitz site, was bombed 4 times between August 1944 to December 1944. Also in December 1944, the American 455th Bomb Group bombed Monowitz and targets close to Auschwitz to Birkenau, the main extermination centre, and they also hit an SS military hospital. But further reconnaissance of Auschwitz was taking place, and sometimes this was photographed accidentally, as recon planes would look at nearby military targets instead. But the question as to how successful the bombing of Auschwitz would have been has been raised. One historian wrote of this that, "It is impossible to claim that Auschwitz-Birkenau could not have been bombed. In fact, the 15th Air Force did drop bombs on it by accident on the 13th of September 1944, when SS barracks were hit by bombs, falling short of their intended industrial targets." The question rather becomes one of the likelihood of hitting the 4 main gas chamber crematoria complexes along the west side of Birkenau, and the likelihood that the bombs would have fallen in profusion on the rows and rows of adjacent prisoner barracks. Accuracy is thus the central issue. One of the biggest problems around this was the fact the Allies would be concerned about killing innocent people with their own bombs, and if they did this, then they would have in a sense been helping the Nazis with their destructive ideas about exterminating those within the camps, and the Nazi propaganda would have gone into overdrive about this. But this was a time in which precision bombing was not the most accurate. But there were proposals, as mentioned, to bomb Auschwitz and the train tracks. There were debates around this, and the Allies would reject this initially, as they did not want to bomb places where there were Jews, but in many countries, including Switzerland, there were protests and rallies to get the Americans and President Roosevelt to bomb the camp and the train tracks leading to it. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill did not see the bombing of the site as a solution, and he knew the aircraft would kill prisoners on the ground, and he believed that the war on the continent and land should be won first by the Allies. But other accounts do exist that state that Churchill pushed for the bombings, and that he wrote in July 1944, "All concerned in this crime who may fall into our hands, including the people who obeyed orders by carrying out these butcheries, should be put to death." But when the British Air Ministry were ordered to investigate the possibility of bombing the camps, they decided not to for operational reasons, which was not specified. But what if the Allies had chosen to bomb the railway lines? Logistically, it made sense for them to do so, due to the industrial products being made at the camp for the German war effort. German air defences around 1944 were weaker than they had been, and the accuracy of Allied bombing was getting stronger. But there was no political will to bomb the train lines. But they could have saved hundreds of thousands. Auschwitz before 1944 was not the most deadly concentration camp and extermination centre, as the Nazis had slaughtered more inside of Treblinka. But then in summer 1944, Auschwitz overtook the other death camps, due to the pace of the slaughter being ramped up. In March 1944, the Germans invaded occupied Hungary, and the Nazis would force hundreds of thousands into ghettos, but they would then be deported between May the 15th and July the 9th, 1944, and they moved around 438,000 Jews on 147 trains from Hungary to Auschwitz, where they were then slaughtered when they arrived at the camp. The Nazis even built extra railroads put directly to Auschwitz-Birkenau to carry out the horrific exterminations in what was known as Operation Hearse. The gas chambers were working 24/7, and the camp could not deal with the amount of people who were being killed. If the Allies would have interrupted this, then thousands may have been saved, especially if they targeted the railway, as a method of transporting the prisoners and victims was pivotal to the Nazi plans and the efficiency. It did take the Nazis 8 months to build the crematoria and the gas chambers, and to rebuild these in 1944 would have been difficult at the time, especially with the demands of the war, and as the war was turning against the Germans. But the SS would have then resorted to shooting the inmates if the gas chambers would have been targeted, as there was also little chance to transfer prisoners to other camps, such as Mauthausen and Buchenwald, for their deaths, as these camps were not capable of accepting hundreds of thousands of inmates at short notice. The Verber Wetzlar report from escaped prisoners would also tell of the life and death of Auschwitz, but one thing to consider is that the Nazis would probably and possibly have executed the prisoners and victims elsewhere if the train tracks to Auschwitz would have been hit. The efficiency of the death operation at the camp would have been disrupted, but the Nazis would have executed the victims in ways like the Einsatzgruppen did, who would shoot hundreds of thousands in pits which had been dug. The Allies were also worried about the reprisals against the prisoners, that there would be less chance of surviving if the Allies took specific action against the railway, and they believed this would have resulted in the 100% deaths of prisoners, with those all being killed. But the argument is that some prisoners would have died, but would it have saved more lives ultimately? The inaction by the British and the Americans in particular was seen by some as a death sentence for thousands of people. But the Americans would strike a concentration camp, as they would in August 1944 attack the Guslav ammunition works at the Buchenwald concentration camp. The attack completely destroyed the armaments factory in one single well-aimed blow. But there were prisoners who were killed in the attack, not because of stray bombs, but because the prisoners were working in the factory at the time. They were not allowed to retreat by the SS guards when the aircraft was spotted. One former prisoner stated that the Allied pilots in particular did all they could in order not to hit prisoners. The high number of prisoners killed is to be charged exclusively against the debit accounts of the Nazi murderers. But what is surprising is that the Allies had all the information they needed about the destruction of Auschwitz, and they should have tried to take action to prevent people being sent to their deaths inside of the deadliest concentration camp of the Second World War. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.